At the beginning of the 19th century, the Tsarist regime intensified its anti-Armenian campaign. The Armenian schools, churches were closed down, papers were shut down, the activity of benevolent companies was restricted, and the Armenian intellectuals were actively persecuted. In July 12, 1903, the Tsar Nikolai II issued a new law whereby he was proclaiming his right to confiscate the properties of the church. This was a strong blow to the Armenian church and the schools, which depended on the church's revenues. This new rule caused much commotion within the Armenians. The ARF and the Hanchakian parties organized meetings and demonstrations. The bloody encounters between the Russian government and the Transcaucasian Armenians increased. It wasn't until the beginning of the First Russian Revolution in 1905 that the Tsar was forced to abolish the law of 1903. During the same time, Western Armenians were living under horrible conditions. While the Tsarist regime was trying to absorb Armenians into the Russian nation through active persecutions, Turkey was organizing massacres due to their intolerance of racial and religious minorities. The Armenian freedom fighters were the only means of defense for the Armenians. One of the most famous figures of the Armenian freedom movement was Serop Akhpyr, who became a victim of a treacherous scheme. After his death, Antranik became the commander of the Taron Sasun troops. Other courageous leaders were Harair and Gevorg Chavush. The first duty of Antranik as a leader was to punish the Kurdish warlord who killed Serop. Starting from 1901, he led many fights nearby Mush Arakelos Monastery, where they made a clever and heroic escape, cutting through the enemy line. These events fortified the will of Armenians and gave them hope for the future. However, the Armenian freedom fighters were a few hundreds, and with the help of a few brave troops from Sasun, they were still outnumbered by the Turkish army. After many brave battles, the leader, Harair, was killed. Antranik managed to escape abroad with his fighters, and after many victorious clashes with the Turkish army, Gevorg Chavush died in the famous Battle of Sulukh in 1907. In the years of 1905 to 1906, Armenians were also forced to fight to defend themselves against the Azerbaijanis in Baku, Shushi, Zangezur, Yerevan, Nakhichevan, Gandzak, and Tbilisi, and as well as other regions. The Tsarist government's encouragement of the Azeri assaults on Armenians was apparent in their permissive attitude towards the injustices committed by their leaders. Renowned Armenian general and political figure Drastamat Ganayan, Dro, took initiative and punished one of their leaders, Nitin, the governor of Baku. Once again, the ARF and Hanchakian parties organized troops and started defending the Armenians in Transcaucasia. Nikol Tuman, Dro, Keri, Murat Sepastatsi, Armen Garon, Sako Sevgaretis, and many others were the prominent figures of this movement. In 1908, the Unification and Progress Party of Young Turks accomplished revolution in the government. The country became a constitutional government. They invited Armenians to the parliament, where they managed to occupy 10 seats. Armenians were working enthusiastically with this new government in the hopes of gaining independence one day. However, all hopes were gone when, on April of 1909, 30,000 Armenians were massacred in Kilikia and Adana vilayets, meaning states, by the permission of the government. In January 26, 1914, a treaty was signed between Turkey and Russia, whereby Turkey was obliged to introduce reforms in Western Armenia. Western Armenia was divided into two, with two administrative bodies. The two regions were supposed to be governed by European commissary. of Christian faith who would be recommended by the Europeans and instated by the Sultan. This treaty did not give autonomy to Armenians, but reforms regarding lifestyle and ownership. The commissaries were just instated when World War I erupted, and the Armenian issues remained unresolved. The leaders of the Ittihad party, Talyat, Enver, Jamal, became the head of the government and already started to ruminate their plan of pan-Turanism. This plan incorporated the Turkish dream of creating a Turkish-speaking kingdom by acquiring the Caucasus, then Central Asia, to under Baikal. Turkey was fighting along Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria against England, France, and Russia. In 1914, Russia and Turkey were militarily engaged, and their main battlefield was Armenia. Armenians were forced to fight against each other, although the initial political approach of the Armenians under the leadership of the ARF political party was to stay impartial. However, 250,000 Armenian soldiers were enlisted in the Russian army, and volunteer troops started to form, mainly composed of Western Armenians. There were 8,000 to 10,000 soldiers in these 7 volunteer troops, under the command of Armenian generals like Dero, Antranik, Hamazasp, Keri, Vartan, Afsharian, and Arutian. They showed courage and determination, especially in the battles of Sarigamish, Dilman, Van, Revanduz, Mush, and others. After the capture of Western Armenian territories, there was no need for the Armenian troops in the Caucasus, therefore they were transferred to other locations. In the same year, in the Near East, Armenians living in the Arabian countries were also fighting against the Turks in the Armenian legions as part of the French-British armies. During the years of 1915 to 1916, part of Western Armenia was occupied by 500,000 Russian army troops and stayed under Russian rule until 1917. The leaders of the Turkish government, Talyat, Enver, Cemal, Behaeddin, Shakir, and others, held the Armenians responsible for their losses in the Caucasus and started the official annihilation of Western Armenians in April of 1915. The first blow of the Young Turks was to the intellectual class of the Armenian society. On April 24, 1915, in Constantinople, Zmyurnia, more than 600 Armenian intellectuals were arrested and exiled to different corners of Minor Asia and brutally murdered. They included talented public and political figures of Turkey and members of scientific and cultural societies like Grigor Zohrab, Daniel Varujan, Siamanto, Antranik, and Ruben Zartarian. At the meantime, Armenians in the Turkish army were stripped of power, and from then on, the deportation and massacres of the peaceful population of Western Armenia began. The majority of the people died at the slightest sign of opposition. The rest died in the Arabian desert, and very small percentage survived somehow and found refuge in the diaspora cities. The result of this treacherous act against humanity was the death of 1.5 million Armenians, which was planned, ruminated, and perpetrated by the Turks. The Armenians were dragged into war against their will and became the victims of the bloody war. They lost a big portion of their population, and their fatherland was emptied of Armenians. When World War I ended with the defeat of Turkey and Germany, a public lawsuit was initiated against the perpetrators of the genocide, and military court found the Young Turks guilty and sentenced them to death. As the Turkish government failed to implement the court order regarding the Young Turks in the 1920s, few young Armenians brought the perpetrators of genocide to justice. To date, the memory of the victims of the genocide is sacred to all Armenians, who struggled to protect and defend the national political rights of all Armenians and their re-establishment. During the genocide, Armenians in western Armenia made several attempts to defend themselves. In Van, they fought for 1.5 months against 10,000 army of Turkish and Kurdish soldiers under the command of Aram Manukyan and Armenak Yerkanyan, until they received help from Russian troops under the command of Vartan and Khecho, and successfully managed to save 120,000 people from Van and Vaspurakan, who fled to eastern Armenia. However, other attempts had bloody endings. In Mush and Sasun, Armenians fought for 6 to 7 months, but as they ran out of ammunition and the Russian help was delayed, they were all massacred at the end. Armenians in Shapin-Karahisar and Urfa shared the same fate. The people of Mount Musa were the few fortunate ones who escaped from the bloody massacres. Refusing to comply with the Turks, they found refuge in the Mount Musa, and from there fought the Turkish army for 40 days, until by the request of the Armenian, a French steamship arrived and transported some 4,000